Well, hey everybody, welcome back from lunch. We're going to talk about pretty pictures for a bit because shockingly pretty pictures are what we human beings are all about. We've been a visual culture, since the beginning of time, and we're seeing this repeat itself in the digital world now in a way that's really unprecedented. We're sharing moments in our history that are funny, that are sad, that are touching, that are unbelievable. I'm not going to go there. Things that are changing us and that affect us. And sometimes, honestly, we don't have words for them. Now, if you want to go back a few years, there are kind of some fun little inflection points in the history of images that I think you'll find really interesting. So the first is, for any of you old movie buffs out there, the film It Happened One Night. And in the film It Happened One Night with Clark Gable and Claudette Colbert, there was this moment that was the most sort of shocking and controversial moment. And the two of them are stuck in a train car. It's this kind of like crazy sort of madcap thing. And he's just sort of teasing her and she's like offended. And finally they're gonna go to sleep and he pulls off his shirt and he's not wearing an undershirt. And so there's this moment of shock, that happens in the culture. But then what ends up happening is that sales of undershirts among men just kind of like cratered. So he kind of killed the undershirt market. And this is, by the way, this is like a 1930s torso, not to go into too much detail. So then fast forward to President Kennedy's inauguration. The thing that's really kind of notable about this photo is not what's in it, but what's not in it. He's not wearing a hat. And men wore hats, really up until the late 50s, early 60s. And so this is sort of considered to be a moment where Kennedy is responsible for sort of killing the hat market. Now, some people will say that it wasn't him, but I'm just going to stick with the story. And then the third one is the lovely Brigitte Bardot, who is actually credited with creating a market, and that would be the bikini market. So if we fast forward to today, in the research that I did for this report, there were so many conversations with brands and with technology providers and experts and academics, and they all said sort of a version of this, which is that people are communicating visually so much more than they used to. And it's a lot more ephemeral. Obviously there are platforms like Snapchat which are ephemeral by design, but it's more ephemeral than it was before. But the important thing here is that it's now a visual conversation. And so if you, like me, like to back things up with numbers, take a look at Mary Meeker's slide. This is one of maybe 180 from the deck that she does every year, which is the state of the internet. And she's looking at visual communication as well, and she's finding, and let me just kind of caveat this slide to death because it's really hard to measure how many images are being shared, sort of at a large scale on the internet, just because we don't have access to a lot of them, we can't pull a lot of them. However, if she's just looking at Facebook properties, which is Facebook, Messenger, Instagram, WhatsApp, and I'm forgetting something, plus Snapchat, that in and of itself is over 3 billion images being shared every single day. And so the world is becoming a lot more visual. Now here's where it matters. It's not just that the world is becoming a lot more visual, but the way that we communicate is also becoming a lot more visual. So there was a study that happened last year in Wales, actually, at the University of Bangor. And this study was looking at the fastest growing language in the United Kingdom. And they looked to see sort of what is the language that is actually growing at the fastest rate, and that also as a language is growing by adding more kind of, forms of expression. And the fastest growing language in the United Kingdom last year was something that looks like that, emoji. And there's some interesting research underneath. Believe this if you will or if you won't, but there's some interesting stuff underneath this. And any of you who have teenage kids or who know a teenage kid or are or know millennials or any other younger folks know that emoji, or even me, because I'm a huge emoji person, that people communicate a ton in emojis these days. And so part of the really interesting finding in this report was that younger people said, and particularly teens said, that when they had an emotion that was a difficult emotion that they wanted to communicate, they felt a lot more comfortable communicating it in an emoji than in language. And I think that's kind of an interesting finding. And if you think about, now this is structured data for any of you who are sort of geeking out about all of this. This is structured data. I mean, it's a way of organizing, unstructured feelings and unstructured sentiment into something that's a little bit more manageable from a processing standpoint. But if you look at what Facebook has done with reactions, that's another way of doing that. It's yet another sort of proof point along the way that the world is getting a whole bunch more visual. Now, here's the kicker if you're a brand. They're talking about you, but they're not talking to you. And this is something that was shared over and over and over again. Sometimes they will talk to you, but a lot of the times they won't. In fact, I have heard anything from 65% to 80% of content that is relevant to your brands is being shared without specifically calling you out. And this is a really kind of interesting example. This is Anna Ivanovic at one of the US Open Series events. And when you look at this photo, I'm sure all of you immediately looked at it, it's like, oh, it's a woman playing tennis. And it's a woman playing tennis at a match. He did that in milliseconds. So a couple things to know about this. Number one is it's not just a photo of a woman playing tennis. There are actually two other human beings in the photo. There are two men in the background. But if you're Esurance or you're Sony Ericsson, there's something far more interesting about this going on because you paid a whole lot more of money to have your name on that wall. And so now we're starting to see that with image sharing and this idea of image intelligence that I'm going to introduce, that now we can start to better understand things like the propagation of your brand, the ROI of your sponsorship investment, and things like that. And so when we think about this image and the way that it's most likely shared, if any of you who are tennis fans who might have seen or shared this image or any other image that has, that's of a football game, a soccer match, tennis, swimming, anything else, a concert, you're not going to be saying, oh, and by the way, guess who sponsored it? Unless you happen to work for the company, right? So then you have to. But in this case, you start to see that there is this implication that's really interesting because if you're Esurance or Sony Ericsson, you're not going to know unless somebody specifically tags you or unless you have a system that can actually recognize your logo in that image. So let's kind of talk about where I'm going with this. So the big question is, okay, so you can see images, okay, that's really interesting, but so what? Well, the big question is, can it be predictive? And so I think about this in three categories. The first is you have to figure out what it is. You have to detect the image. So you have to see, yes, it's a woman, yes, it's a logo, yes, it's an apple, yes, it's a laptop, yes, it's a car, whatever that might be. The next thing you have to do is figure out some social analytics on it, the same way that we've done for the last 10 years with social analytics that are language-based, right? You want to understand sharing behavior. You want to understand things like how far it went, particularly, reach kinds of things if you're looking at ad targeting. You want to understand the sentiment maybe with which it was shared. Maybe it's a smashed package on a doorstep at the holiday with the hashtag WTF, right? And the visible logo. So you want to understand that. And then the third thing, this is the money shot, right, is to understand, so given that, could we build a predictive model based upon that? Could we benchmark it? Could we understand what's normal, what's not normal? And can we actually predict or start to predict things that might happen? So I'm sure all of you have seen, many of the memes and many of the, issues that swirl around the internet these days. And if they're related to you or your brand, there's a point at which you have to act. And so starting to understand that for issues management, for crisis management, or just simply to get in the game, with a meme before it's that, there's sort of the zone at which something's super cool, and then there's the zone at which your parents find out, or you're the parent and you find out, and that's the sort of lame zone, right? After which you can no longer post. We saw this actually a couple years ago at the, I think it was MTV Music, or MTV? Was it MTV or was it the Grammys when Pharrell wore his hat, And then Arby's got in the game and said, hey Pharrell, you stole our hat. And it was really cute. And then like all these other brands, there was a certain point after which it wasn't cute anymore. It was just kind of like, ugh. So you want to understand the point at which you can actually do something of value with it. So let me now kind of just define this so we're all on the same page. So I'm thinking of image intelligence as aspirational, okay? But the point here is that you want to be able to detect and understand images so that you can build predictive models on them and you can spot trends. Because that's what we all want to do, right? We want to be trend spotters. And if any of you have seen this before, it probably looks familiar to you. This is a framework I developed 5 years ago or so when I wrote my very first piece on social analytics called A Framework for Social Analytics. Actually, that was 2012, however, 5 years ago, oh my God. Okay, so 5 years ago, and that was 6 categories of business value. Because we're not just simply talking about what's the ROI of taking a photograph, right? We're talking about much more complicated ways of measuring value. So we can look at the value to the brand. Does it tell us something good or bad about the brand? Does it tell us how it's trending? We could look at marketing optimization. Where should we spend our money? What's our media mix? How can we target this ad? Is our campaign working? We can look at things like revenue generation. Is it leading to conversions? Can people actually convert on this image? Is it improving our search results? Is it doing other things that might actually accrue to top line? Operational. Is it helping us be more productive? Is it helping deflect calls from the call center? I see the image, I can now respond to it online, and I can answer a question. Or I see the image and I realize this is fraud, this is counterfeit. I will tell you a story. I cannot tell you which company it was, but I will tell you a story of a credit card company that discovered that young people getting their first credit cards were uploading them to the internet because they were proud that they got their first credit cards. And the credit card company had to sort of like deactivate the card and send them a little like, you might not want to do that again kind of note, right? There's also stuff like out and out fraud and trademark infringement. I'll show you that too. So there's some really interesting stuff you can do there. Then we get into customer experience, that sort of hashtag WTH or WTF, you know, depending on your preference, on a package, a delivery package. That might tell you something about the customer experience you might not have seen. I think of these, and I thought of these in the first report as blind spots. So stuff where stuff is happening, you just can't tell. And then finally, it's around innovation, product innovation. One of the stories, I guess, around product innovation would be people who use products in a way that you didn't expect them to. That's bad if you're a pharma company because you have to disclose it to the FDA, but it's really interesting and good if you're maybe a food company or a restaurant chain or you're you know, some kind of CPG company. So those are kind of the elements of business value. And if you download this report, which you're more than welcome to do, and you know, I can have the folks send around a link, there are 30 use cases that map to those 6 categories. So let's talk about some in a little bit of detail. So the first thing, you know, I picked another tennis player because, you know, it's fun. But the first one is really around that sponsorship ROI example that I mentioned. So we sponsor this thing, we spent this much last year. Is our reach increasing? Are we actually getting more impressions than we wanted to before? You know, any of you who know me know that I'm not a huge fan of impressions, but if you're paying for a sponsorship, impressions are your currency. So that's important. The metric has to, you know, map to the business value that an executive would understand. The next thing is around something really interesting that came up, having to do with moments of consumption. How do people use our products like in the wild? And we don't really get to see that, right? And we certainly don't get to see that at scale. You know, you might get lucky and see an image. In fact, I was looking at Instagram one day because I was kind of thinking about this issue, and I saw a photograph of a picnic table. And on the picnic table was a bottle of Califia almond milk and a package of Driscoll's blueberries. And you could see, you know, the logos were pretty clear, so image recognition could have seen it. This is just me looking, right? And then you see other things on the picnic table. And then I looked to see whose account it was, and it was a food blogger. And this food blogger was talking about healthy smoothie recipes that she was making. So then I looked down in the comments, and like, you know, what are the comments? So this is what I have to do for a living, apparently. So I looked down in the comments, and I see Califia writes in and says, hey, you know, we noticed that you're using our product. That's really great. You know, we wonder if maybe we could talk to you about doing something a little bit more formally. So that moments of consumption is interesting. Maybe if you're Driscoll's and you're Califia, you might want to talk to each other. In this case, you can see Hellmann's mayonnaise in the background, and I'm not going to vouch for this lunch because I find it weird and I always end up using it anyway. But like, you know, in this particular example, you can see that even though it's sort of there in the background and it's just the logo, it does give you a sense that that people are using my product in this context. Another story I told at lunch, which I think is a really interesting one too, again, can't tell you the company, but a furniture manufacturer was really interested in understanding how do people share images of their furniture. And a lot of times, you know, what happens now is you buy a new sofa or you buy some new, you know, a new bed or bed, whatever, side tables, and you put it in your room and then you take a photograph of it and you upload it to Instagram and you hashtag it with the company name, right? And so they knew that and they wanted to see, well, what are people, you know, when they upload our photos, like what do they look like? And so they saw all these photos and they discovered this really interesting pattern, which is that most of them had pets in them. And they thought, well, that's really interesting. Maybe we should put pets in our catalogs more prominently. Maybe we should think about pet furniture, pet, you know, dog beds and stuff like that. Maybe we should change our marketing so that we're focusing more on the idea that people have pets in their home and we shouldn't be photographing our furniture in such a pristine way. And so that kind of gave them food for thought. Now, again, some of these things are food for thought. Some of these things are immediate ROI. And then the third one explains itself, right? I don't know if any of you have ever tried oil of Olay, but apparently it's out there. You can buy it somewhere. I don't know where. If you're a company, for example, like a Yum Brands or, you know, any company that has a franchise, I believe Yum is franchised, so don't kill me if it's not, but that has a franchise model, you know, you want to understand how your brand is being propagated. You want to see if people are doing things off-brand, if they're changing colors, if they're tweaking the logo. You want to understand whether, for example, the logo is propagating across regions properly. You want to do that as a brand management kind of best practice. So that's another use case. So just a quick sense of how this works. I'm going to really kind of simplify this because it gets into a lot of, I mean, unless you want me to tell you in detail how neural networks work, and then you'll all fall asleep. But so there are kind of 4 things that you could see in an image. And you'll hear different ways of categorizing this, but just to give you a sense. So the first thing is objects. Is it a person? Is it a car? Is it a tree? Is it a boat? Is it a, you know, whatever. The next thing is attributes. And attributes could be the shape. Is it round? Is it square? What color is it? How many of them are there? Attributes could also be things like weather, you know, is it cloudy outside? Is it sunny outside? Then you can see scenes. The scenes could be like a conference, a concert, a football match, a wedding, shopping, you know, a grocery store, that kind of thing. So anything that sort of organizes those objects or those objects and those attributes into something that is recognizable. And then the last thing is emotion. And you know, there are facial detection, as you know. Any of you who use Facebook, which is probably almost all of you, know that there's face detection. There's also emotion detection software. Apple bought an emotion detection company, Emotioned, I think, over the last year. I don't know that they've said too much about what they want to do, but I have heard stories that particularly sports franchises want to use emotion detection because they want to understand whether their fans are excited at their games. Are they as excited as they were last time and the time before and the time before? If I wanted to run emotion detection on all of you, I would want to know how many of you looked bored or excited or interested, et cetera, right? So that's the kind of 4th piece. Now, here's a little bit more about what you have to do. Now, just to explain what happens, so I will explain a little bit about a neural network. So it's essentially just a computer simulation of how the brain works. And so like the human brain, you have to show it things and then it learns from them. It's much more literal than we human beings are. But you have to do things like say, here are a bunch of photographs. You have to train the data. This is a backpack, this is a backpack, this is a backpack, this is a backpack, this is a backpack. Then you give it another photograph and it says, that's a backpack. Or, I don't think that's a backpack. The thing is, or you do the same thing obviously with these dogs. The thing is, you have to train it on the thing that you want it to understand, but you have to train it on everything else. So if you only train it on backpacks, then everything will be a backpack, sort of like that old saying, if all you have is a hammer, everything is a nail. So if you train it on backpacks and then it's only ever seen backpacks, you show it a picture of me, it will be like, I will be some kind of backpack, which is bizarre. And in fact, I heard a story early on about the early training of Watson, IBM Watson in the day. And when they were first starting to show images to Watson, Watson thought dogs were people and classified dogs as a kind of person. And they discovered, actually, by looking at the data, that it was just because most of the dogs in the data set were in the context of a family. So there's like mom and dad, or dad and kids and dog. And so the dog is just another element of family. Family is human, dogs are human. So that's kind of how it works. The other thing you can see from this is that color doesn't matter if you're a backpack, but it really matters if you're a beagle. And so then you start to understand, well, what attributes are important to understand and to look at, because some attributes don't matter. In backpack, it's all about the shape and nothing else. With dogs, there's all sorts of variations. And by the way, this is a particular breed of dog, and any of you who have seen any of the Facebook stuff can see that they're also training to be able to recognize dog breeds and all sorts of things. So here's one more example. So here's 16 bagels. Some of them have tails. You've probably seen this meme, so it's not like I'm showing it to you for the first time. But like, some of the bagels have tails and they have noses and stuff like that. I actually ran this through a demo from a vendor just to see what would happen. Completely untrained data set, no prior work, just, and this is how it works. Like, you have to train the data, which means that when you kind of make decisions about what you're going to use, you still have to invest that time to train the data, or the time needs to be invested to train the data by somebody, right? By somebody. It could be the vendor, it could be you, it could be some combination. This is all very new. But in this case, the demo missed it entirely and thought that the dogs were delicious breakfast. So that was, and do you call that a failure? No, you just call that a need to train the data. And then what ends up happening is you start showing it the tagged pictures of bagels, the tagged pictures of dogs. There are all sorts of different ways of doing this. I'm not going to go into all the nuances of it, but at the end of the day, it's really about understanding that we have to help these sort of neural networks, these computer brain simulations, learn to do that. That's called machine learning. We have to train them, and then from there they start to draw inferences. Some of them will be correct, some of them will be incorrect, and that is an ongoing process. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there's also it kind of captures our biases too. And any of you who have seen some of the stories about mistakes that Flickr made last year with tagging for example, a photograph as a sports facility, and in fact it was Dachau, the concentration camp, because there was a gate in front of a field and a building in the back, and it thought that it was a sports facility. It thought that it was like some kind of sports facility, and in fact they tagged it sport, and offending tons and tons of people and upsetting tons and tons of people. These can be funny, like the bagel and the puppy, or they could be really upsetting. And so when we look at the number of images being shared, it's impossible to eliminate bias, because bias tells you what to look for, but then it also brings up some bias that we might not necessarily know about. Now, so this image is actually of something in the lower right. If you look at that little photo of a woman, that's called the Shirley card. And back in the early days of photo printing, Kodak at that time had the market share on photo printing, any of you who remember taking film to a place to be developed, that's like ancient history now. And so when they got their photo printers, they would get this little Shirley card, and they print the image, and if the image came out looking, Shirley came out looking good, then the image would come out looking good. So it had this really huge drawback, which is that it was horrible for images of people of color. And it wouldn't color correct properly. And so for years, this was a problem for people. And so Kodak, over the years, came out with a new types of Shirley cards to basically be able to serve people whose needs had not been served in the past and who had been sort of affected by this. And then also in the 70s, they came out with a new kind of film that was much better at printing photographs of people with darker skin tones. And so technology has a tendency to sort of encode our biases. And so when we look at images, we have to be careful about the way that we train them so that we don't include assumptions that could end up blowing back on us in some way or another, whether those are societal or cultural, or whether they're business because we simply didn't think about a particular market segment that we should have, or we didn't give it enough credit. Now, there are some privacy implications. I always talk about this, so images are no different. It's a little different to think about image sharing than it is to think about word sharing. This would be a really interesting survey question to ask, but if you were to think to yourself, like, what feels more personal to you? Is it your words or your photos? I bet a lot of you might say it's your photos. And so there hasn't been enough, technology can never, or the law can never keep up with technology and sort of the range of, or the speed at which technology moves. I mean, we can't do it either, right? So we're always a little bit behind. But there are privacy implications to image sharing. Instagram has particular restrictions on its terms of service. We're going to see more of this. But this is just basically a kind of point to stop and reflect and say, when we start to use people's images, whether they're our owned images or whether they're user-generated content images, we start to think about those. We need to think about sort of the unanticipated consequences. Now, there are a few challenges too, and these are not challenges in a critical bad way. These are challenges in a way that we just have to work out, because this is a pretty new, at least for commercial purposes, right? This is a pretty new technology. Obviously, image recognition has been around for years, and it does all sorts of things from power, driverless cars to, radiology to all sorts of other stuff. But for commercial purposes, for people like us, this is still pretty new. So let me talk a little bit about that stuff. So the first thing is, this is a very new technology landscape, lots of different players, lots of different ways of approaching. And also, the other thing that's really important to understand is that this isn't like the days of business intelligence, or even sort of where we are with social data now, where you can kind of ask a question and get an answer. Any of you who've worked in social data for the last, say, for more than about the last 5 years, remember the early days were kind of ugly, right? It was a bit of a wild, wild west. There wasn't a lot of clarity about where sources were from. There wasn't a lot of clarity about what metrics should exist, or how you measure it, or how you talk to executives, or how much time you should spend, or how much time it should take. We are there with images now. And so, if I have any advice for you, it's simply to, accept that, understand that's where we are, understand that unlike the, or like natural language processing, there is a good deal of artificial intelligence built into this. That's what, that's the outcome of machine learning. And so we're at the beginning of this new sort of AI-infused age where it's just going to change the way that we work a little bit, and we're going to have to be a little bit more scientific in the way that we approach things, meaning we're going to have to experiment a lot. So I want to conclude, and then I'm happy to take a couple questions if we have time, by just saying, even famous cosmologists like Neil deGrasse Tyson like being wrong because they learn stuff. And if you've been hearing people say this to you for the last 10 years and you're sort of over it, allow me to say it to you one more time. It is really, really important, because we are now in a world where we are going to be, whether it's with images or other types of data, training our systems to do the things that we want them to do. And that's going to be an interaction between us and machines and technology companies, and that's the reality that we're going to live in. So we may as well get used to it, because that's kind of where it's going. Now, if you'd like to download this report yourself, here's the link. You're more than welcome to do it. If you'd like to ask me about it, I'm more than happy to do that. And certainly NetBase, is completely has my permission to send it out. So thank you so much for your attention, and let me know if you have any questions.
Perfect, Susan. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure thing.
Susan.
Hi, thanks. That was a really great talk.
Thank you.
So actually, I just wanted to mention that the fact that artificial neural networks are called that is a vestige of the, when in the 1980s they were first proposed as the computational units were binary on-off units that were analogous to a neuron firing or not, and that's where the similarity of the brain ends. So I think it's really important to emphasize that first. But when you talk about trying to have these models recapitulate human biases or not, and you talk about supervised learning, where we're talking about tagging the images and training things, do you think that's more or less interesting than unsupervised learning, where you're going to get something that might be better at distinguishing categories, but they're not going to be mapping onto concepts that humans necessarily have?
So, okay, so that's a super sophisticated question. Let me see if I can kind of restate it for the room. So there are a couple ways to do learning. One is supervised, where you basically are tagging images and then saying, giving them another image, and then it comes back and says, oh yeah, that's a backpack. There's another one where you just have a corpus of data, so a body of data, and you give it an image without any interaction at all, and then it says it is what it is. I have a natural bias in this talk, which is that I'm assuming that there's going to be a lot more supervised learning happening among this audience than unsupervised for the time being, only because we each have our own distinct brands. We're furniture companies, we're restaurants. We're going to want to distinguish a, Taco Bell from a McDonald's, from a Coca-Cola, from a Pepsi. We're going to want to make sure that that there's enough clarity in terms of what we want to be able to get the results that we want. I don't, in terms of unsupervised learning, I'm just not sure when we think about the reality of the people who are using these tools on the ground, whether that's the right use of time. But but I'll be honest, I don't have a strong opinion on this yet, because I'm actually in the midst of doing research for this report on AI that has to answer that question too. I'm hearing a lot of different things, and so my tendency is now to try to say, let's make this as simple as possible, because I think there is a huge load on everyone in this room to do all the things that they have to do in the course of a day, and so simplifying things and trying to get to the easiest possible interaction, I think, is kind of at the top of my list. But thank you for that question. Anybody else? No? Okay then. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan.